I believe nowadays we focus more on food and we forget a little bit about imagination. We are what we eat, okay, yes, and we eat what we are, and we also are where we eat and who we eat with and why we eat. But when I got into university, we wanted to be scientists because, and we are scientists, we want to be scientists, but the thing is, we were focusing more on the objective subjects such as physiology and anatomy and biology and molecular biology and all of those subjects, and we were putting aside our subjects that talked about the history of food and social behavior around the table and things like that, because nutrition sometimes is viewed as not a hard science, is viewed as something that is an opinion, which is not. So in order to reinforce the force of the scientific field of nutrition, we sometimes forget the other part that involves food around mostly social sciences. She was 36 years old, she lived with 2 daughters, and she was an industrial worker, so she worked in a factory. What I diagnosed was obesity type 1, hypertension, classic case, unfortunately in Portugal, and she was recovering from persistent depressive disorder. I assessed her nutritional needs, I elaborated a plan a few weeks later, and I received an email from Jane. And she said that since our appointment she was feeling better, okay, she really liked the meal plan that I prepared, she thought she was losing weight. But what happened is she said that she was not very happy or jolly around work because since she had a new meal plan that actually didn't fit the bar at the factory, she had to eat alone. So she became a little bit isolated and spent more time alone. But she said, but what has to be, has to be. So if this is what I have to be, what I have to do, it's fine. And that resonated with me because actually it didn't have to be that way. I just didn't ask her. So I just didn't ask her how was the environment she was eating with. And what we did in terms of curiosity was we developed another strategy. She sent me a picture of the bar all her colleagues were eating, and sometimes she would take cold meals she didn't have to preheat and eat alone, or sometimes she would choose from the menu something I had approved or tell her it was okay. So she lost her weight and she's very happy still. I really do believe that it's important to recognize food and meals as the starting point for different social and cultural pathways, and even for professionals that aren't necessarily educated to think in those terms, and to see beyond nutrients. That's why interdisciplinarity is so important, and I think these events are so interesting because we get to learn from people who have very different backgrounds from ours, and we actually get to intertwine our thoughts and improve. Of course, there's always space for improvement. That's our utopia. That's my utopia, to live in a world where health is the common norm and it's the usual. And of course, there's room for it because there's always more meals to come.
Amitav Ghosh has recently defended in a book I would recommend everybody interested in this area called The Great Derangement, Climate Change and the Unthinkable, that, and I'm quoting, the climate crisis is also a crisis of culture and thus of the imagination that cannot be left to scientists, technocrats and politicians demanding a new language, a new creative vision, a new literature, a renewed encounter between contemporary art, which he thinks has been turning inward, and the natural world. When he comments that the narrative of catastrophe, foregrounding extreme ecological and social meltdowns, to which the epithet of improbable might be tagged, have frequently the opposite effect from what one might expect, resulting in the impulse to project, and I'm quoting him, escapes from both the Earth's ecosystems and from the human flesh, and not in the kind of mobilization of public perceptions that is critical to avoiding a sense of impotence or fatalism. Those with substantial means have moved indoors into our colleges, many of them built and maintained by the very companies that hold water rights. So technology is there to help people sustain themselves, except that only very few can have access to these particular spaces. So in contrast with other dystopias of urban food scarcity set in New York, and there's one that really comes to mind, namely Harry Harrison's Make Room, and its film adaptation Soylent Green, and also in contrast with the cruel landscapes of the dry Southwest groundwater knife, Kim Stanley Robinson's text harbors a kind of paradoxical ambiguity, somewhere between a chilling assessment of risk in the perception that, as Gary Kavanagh points out, quote, climate change is an intensifying feedback loop that we cannot really interrupt and cannot reverse, but can only contain, delay, and prepare for, and the proposition that humanity will, quote, get a grip, as the narrator says, and will not let itself be reduced to the abject condition of total inhumanity.
In a world still very much riddled with corruption, poverty, disease, and war, can climate change be righteously considered the biggest problem facing humanity? There are many world leaders, Donald Trump for example, who still go to extremes to convince everybody else that there is no such thing as global warming or climate change, as if pretending that climate change wasn't real would somehow make it go away. This is not a partisan debate, it is a human one. Clean air and a livable climate are human rights. Nevertheless, more often than not, fiction does anticipate reality, and back in 2013, the kind of watery doomsday scenario announced by DiCaprio's documentary as a serious possibility provided the departing point for José Eduardo Agualusa's novel Life in the Sky, interestingly subtitled A Novel for Youngsters and Other Dreamers. So, as Agualusa points out in his acceptance speech, his book became true by accident, and once again fiction anticipated true facts. For all dreamers, the Republic of Mist represents hope, but only the protection of the most powerful cities can ensure its preservation. Although there is still a divide between rich and poor, in Agualusa's Life in the Sky, that doesn't necessarily mean that the first are happier than the second, since the feeling of imprisonment is shared by all. When the Great Flood arrived, humans had arranged everything so that humanity could persevere out there in the sky. They eliminated everything they could not keep in such severe conditions, and they managed to create a new network of communities that was not so different from what we have nowadays. The book ends with a sense of optimism. Carlos is telling his story and revealing the presence of the Green Island to the world. Amy is ready for more traveling in search of other green islands. The reader is left with one question though. If this fictional future ever becomes our present, will we be prepared?
The only reason I am going to be optimistic is because I am speaking about Star Trek. And as you will see, it is the first really optimistic, again, fiction in ever. It was low budget, it was very, even for 66 standards, was very, let's say just cute, because it was not very well done. The most important thing you have to remember about the Star Trek franchise is it is the first ever popular optimistic vision of the future. In this 24th century we have the equivalent of the United Nations, that is the United Federation of Planets. That is an interstellar alliance composed of planetary governments that agree to exist semi-autonomously under a single central government based on the principles of basically the French Revolution of universal liberty, rights and equality, and with the goal of sharing the knowledge and resources in peaceful cooperation, scientific development, space exploration, and the most important thing, defensive purposes. Another example of it was, of course, is the Klingon Racht. This has to be, it cannot be consumed in a starship because it has to be very, very, very fresh. Because Klingon says, quote, there is nothing worse than a half-dead Racht. What do humans eat in these spaceships? Or in Earth. We know that Earth and its colonies, we know there is no hunger anymore. There is no hunger, there is no want. Money is not used, accumulation of property is frowned upon, and all basic needs and some not so basic are covered. So, as we were saying before, it is obviously a communist utopia. We know also that humanity has colonized many planets, so overpopulation is no longer a problem. In the 24th century, we have three kinds of food. Food in small spaceships for short missions and the like. You have guessed it, is dehydrated astronaut pills and food balls. It's described like eating cardboard, nutritious, not tasty, not interesting. Other limitations of the replicator are not so clear. First thing, this problem with alcohol that makes me worry a lot about the future of humankind and our priorities as a species, but also the replicators, the theory on the paper is they cannot replicate complex organisms. What is the last thing about food? It is considered mainly a hobby. Cooking is a hobby, planting is a hobby. We see in several episodes, we see the wine jars, main hobby, that is interesting part. I suppose the wine jars produce wine that has alcohol. And the social aspects of the food are deeply respected. You still can see something I am not going to try to get here because I haven't written the link to the video. Somebody goes to a planet and comes back with a real egg, and he cooks it for his friends. This real egg, make it scrambled eggs, the most disgusting scrambled eggs ever, but it is a social occasion. So certain things will not change in 24th century. Thank you.